Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. And welcome to the Living with Wildfire webinar series. My name is Zoe Fung, and I'm the Wildfire Conservation Coordinator with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. As more than one of 90 RCDs across the state of California, the Contra Costa RCD facilitates the stewardship and conservation of natural resources in Contra Costa County. So while wildfire is an inevitable phenomenon and can be a positive and regenerative force, catastrophic wildfire negatively impacts both our communities and our natural resources. So the Living with Wildfire series is designed to help Contra Costa County residents and beyond reduce their risk of catastrophic wildfire and become adjusted to living in a fire-adapted region. This series is diving into the Bay Area's historic and contemporary fire regimes, exploring socio-political contexts that impact current land and fire management practices, and allows us to hear directly from local professionals and academics about wildfire mitigation activities that we can implement on an individual, community, and landscape scale. So today we're going to hear from Michelle Katuna at the University of California, Berkeley, with her presentation Towards Collaboration, Understanding Settler Colonialism as Context for California Environmental Management. Before we begin, just please note that the webinar is being recorded, and we will post this to our YouTube channel shortly. We will also have a Q&A session following the presentation, so please feel free to use the Q&A, which is located on the bottom right of your Zoom screen during the presentation if you want to submit any questions, and we will answer those at the end. Please also use a feedback form, which I will put in the chat, if you want to provide the series with any feedback. All right. All right, and you can also propose any future topics you'd like to hear in webinars later. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and I'm going to pass it off to Michelle now.
Thank you, Zoe. And thanks so much to Contra Costa Resource Conservation District for hosting this series and inviting me to be part of it. I'm really happy to be here today. And I also want to thank each of you for taking the time to show up. And I hope you are taking care of yourselves and each other in the world these days. I hope our discussion today is helpful to your work and your relationships. So I'll start by saying how I come to my work, situating my specific, limited way of knowing. My name is Michelle Katuna, and I'm a non-Indigenous person descending from Ashkenazi Jewish and non-Jewish ancestors from both Eastern and Western Europe. My family and I have been guests in North America for 4 to 12 generations, and I grew up in Coast Miwok territory in the North Bay area of California, and I currently work as a tribal liaison for Marin Resource Conservation District. For the past 5 years, I've been part of a collaboration between Marin Resource Conservation District, the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, Point Blue Conservation Sciences Straw Program, and private ranchers. And in 2022, this collaboration brought me back to school to study rangeland management, the context of settler colonialism, and emerging models of partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous actors throughout the state. I'm currently a third-year PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the Environmental Science Policy and Management program, studying under Dr. Peter Nelson and Dr. Jennifer Sauerwein. Today, I speak from Huichin, which is the ancestral homelands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, who are the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. In today's presentation, I contend that settler colonialism is relevant to all non-Indigenous work involving environmental management in California, because it has and continues to change who is managing land and also how land is being managed, both of which have had and continue to have immense impacts on the social, cultural, and ecological relationship. This presentation gives context to a question posed by Karuk Chumash and allied scholars and basket weavers in a 2023 paper led by John Oberholzer-Dent of Stanford University, which provocatively asks, quote, "Why are land management decisions made without those who have been tending the land for thousands of years?" End quote. Through the lens of settler colonialism, I hope we can begin to understand what this question is pointing out and from there move to discussing how non-Indigenous actors can constructively show up to partnerships with California Native American tribes in ways that do not perpetuate Indigenous dispossession and exclusion. Today, we'll look at one, what colonialism and settler colonialism specifically is, two, how settler colonialism has changed both who is managing land and also how land is being managed, and three, examples of what these changes have meant to social, cultural, and ecological relationships. We'll culminate by looking at examples of Indigenous-led and collaborative stewardship today and collected guidance from Indigenous and allied scholars for non-Indigenous partners. This presentation draws from the work of dozens of Indigenous and allied scholars and practitioners. I'm not making these ideas up myself, so I cite them in my bibliography at the end. And also, it would be impossible to include everything in one presentation. So if there's something that I mentioned that you'd like more information about, please bring it up at the end or in follow-up. Also, between everyone in this virtual webinar room, and we have 73 people and maybe more coming, there's immense experience and knowledge based on your own relationships with the specific places and people you work. I will always be learning on this topic, and so I definitely welcome your feedback and perspectives after this talk, and I hope we can have a fruitful Q&A session. Before we begin, I also want to make a brief note on language, specifically what I mean by Indigenous peoples and by California Native American tribes. Indigenous peoples refers to populations throughout the world that have exercised self-governance in a place before colonial invasion and continue to exercise self-governance today, either in their territories or in places they have been displaced to by colonialism. Peoples is intentionally pluralized here to recognize the many differences across Indigenous cultures, worldviews, places, communities, families, and individuals. The concept of Indigenous peoples emerged from activism of the American Indian movement and the Canadian Indian Brotherhood in the 1970s. This word is very inclusive, but it also can be problematic in that it is unspecific and generalizes diverse populations. California Native American tribes, also referred to as tribal nations or just tribes in this presentation, are defined by state law and listed by the Native American Heritage Commission, which recognizes more tribes than federal law, but still is not inclusive of all tribal entities in California. As a result of having entered into treaties with tribal nations, the U.S. federal government and its agencies have a formal trust relationship with and fiduciary responsibility to federally recognized tribes. It is very important this critical recognition of sovereignty be respected and not diminished by laws, policies, or practices related to collaboration, research, or consultation. Throughout this presentation, when speaking generally, I may refer to both Indigenous peoples and tribal nations to be both inclusive and specific, so as to respect tribal sovereignty. With that, I'll start in. All land in California is Indigenous land. The map to the left depicts some, but not all, of the overlapping territories of today's Indigenous peoples and tribal nations, which include 109 federally recognized, more than 65 unrecognized tribal entities. Indigenous peoples and tribal nations across California have great diversity in socio-political organization, economy, size, structure, culture, and regional relationships. From time immemorial and for hundreds of generations, Indigenous peoples and tribal nations in California have and continue to intentionally, dynamically, and adaptively steward a diverse, heterogeneous landscape. Indigenous stewardship practices differ across individuals, families, clans, communities, and regions. And examples of practices include low and medium intensity cultural and prescribed burning, weeding, coppicing, pruning, and seeding. These practices may be done for diverse objectives, including to maintain and produce food, fiber, medicine, and ceremonial species, to tend watersheds and landscapes, to practice culture, and/or to enact social and spiritual responsibilities. Despite the changes non-Indigenous peoples have made to it, ancestral lands are still the foundation for many Indigenous peoples' practice and connection to culture. For example, Greg Saris, who is the chairman of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, in the North Bay, likens his tribe's territory itself to a living sacred text, still laden with ancestral relationships, reminders of important lessons and events, and a teacher to current and future generations. As described by Plains Miwok scholar and practitioner Don Hankins, Indigenous stewardship practices have evolved over time, are specific to place, and are intertwined with California's immense ecological and cultural diversity. Indigenous stewardship often centers the relationships between specific humans, plants, animals, and other than human entities, described by many as a relationship-based approach. Potawatomi scholar Kyle White emphasizes that, like all societies, Indigenous peoples have maintained Indigenous ecologies, or place-specific relationships and ecosystems that provide for their economic, cultural, and political health and self-determination. For example, the photo to the right of a large canyon live oak tree shows the signs of hundreds of years of stewardship by Indigenous peoples in the Klamath region. Notice the low-hanging branches, likely pruned to ease the gathering of acorns, a staple food, and tended with intentionally lit low to moderate severity fire. The tree and landscape are different than they otherwise would be due to this long and ongoing relationship with Indigenous peoples. However, multiple waves of colonialism have disrupted many cultural, ecological, and social relationships like the one described, which we'll talk about next. As you can see from this map of North America, which depicts European invasions from the 16th to 19th century, Indigenous peoples and tribal nations have navigated hundreds of years of multiple, successive, and often overlapping waves of colonialism. Specifically in California, foreign colonizing powers have included Spain from the year 1769 to 1821, Mexico from the years 1821 to 1846, Russia from the years 1812 to 1841, and the United States ongoing since the year 1846. Each colonial regime brought unique structures, policies, and practices, which pose different limitations and also opportunities for Indigenous peoples. American settler colonialism is the latest and ongoing form of colonialism in California, but I'll give a brief overview of the waves of colonialism that came before and how they set the stage for what we see today. To start, from the 15 through the 1700s, some Indigenous peoples in California encountered early European explorers, coming to the coast as part of scouting voyages. In the 17 and 1800s, Spanish, Mexican, and Russian colonial regimes encroached on Indigenous lands in California. Spanish colonists employed a colonial structure known as missionary colonialism, characterized by the exploitation of Indigenous labor and the aim for Indigenous conversion to Christianity and adoption of Eurocentric lifeways. Spanish missions imposed many limitations on Indigenous peoples, including forced removal from homelands, forced hard manual labor, exposure to disease and inhospitable living conditions, and physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. Indigenous lands were taken and granted to Spanish colonists, initiating the ongoing land grant system. New plant and animal species were introduced, new environmental management regimes were imposed, and repressive policies were employed, such as those criminalizing Indigenous burning practices. In 1821, Mexico gained independence from the Spanish crown, and over the following decades secularized the California missions. Land, livestock, and mission buildings were distributed to Mexican colonists, often to establish private ranches. Indigenous peoples were frequently kept in forced servitude as laborers, and at times Indigenous people obtained land grants, though plots were usually small or quickly confiscated by non-Indigenous peoples. Overlapping with both the Spanish and Mexican regimes, Russian colonists employed a colonial structure known as mercantile or managerial colonialism, establishing commercial fur trade and fur trapping and trading posts along the north coast of California to extract resources to sell on the international market. Notably, Russian colonists exploited Indigenous labor and hunted species of cultural importance to local extinction, such as the beaver and the sea otter. Through the waves of colonialism they encountered, Indigenous peoples have and are actively resisting, using strategies including organizing flight and violent revolt missions, applying skills learned to new livelihoods, remaining outside of colonial centers or returning to homeland seasonally, forming new and strategic alliances with colonists, and integrating new species and technologies into the continuing development of Indigenous cultural practices. These prior waves of colonialism set the stage for settler colonialism, the program that American colonists would bring to California starting in 1846. Settler colonialism is an ongoing structure and process that continues to this day, which is why we'll take a closer look. To understand the settler colonial context that non-Indigenous environmental management occurs in today, I find it important to understand the defining characteristics. In the quote shown here, Potawatomi scholar Kyle White defines settler colonialism as, quote, complex social processes in which at least one society seeks to move permanently onto the terrestrial, aquatic, and aerial places lived in by one or more other societies who already derive economic vitality, cultural flourishing, and political self-determination from the relationships they have established with the plants, animals, physical entities, and ecosystems of those places, end quote. Along these lines, settler colonialism requires the elimination of people and ecologies that are indigenous to the land it seeks, but not in any particular way. Strategies of indigenous elimination that have been employed in California include spatial segregation, including relocating indigenous peoples to rancherias or urban centers, genocide enacted by federal, state, and local military and civilians, assimilation through institutions like boarding schools, policies like allotment and termination, and also through irreparable damage to indigenous ecologies. And lastly, indigenous elimination has been enacted through the appropriation of indigenous knowledges, through, for example, environmental and conservation organizations adopting or promoting indigenous stewardship practices without proper relationships, consultation, or consent. Thus, settler colonialism is not a static event of the past, but rather an ongoing structure and process employed by settler institutions and individuals to continue efforts to install a new settler society and ecology over existing indigenous societies and ecologies. So as we discuss the ways that settler colonialism underlies California environmental management today, keep in mind these three unique characteristics of settler colonialism. One, the intent of settler colonists to permanently stay, unlike past waves of colonists. Two, that permanent residency is made possible through policies, practices, and programs animated by a logic of indigenous elimination, which includes these explicit and unconscious attempts to replace, erase, and exclude indigenous peoples. And three, that settler colonialism is not a static event of the past, but an ongoing structure and process disrupting social, cultural, and ecological relationships. From here, we'll look at examples of how settler colonialism has impacted who is stewarding land and how land is stewarded in California. And last, what this has meant for relationships. Settler colonialism has changed who is stewarding land in California through the genocide, removal, and attempted assimilation of indigenous peoples and dispossession of indigenous lands. The 1848 gold rush and 1850 statehood brought an increasing number of American settlers to California, and early federal, state, and local policies and programs were instituted to promote settler access to indigenous land, labor, and natural resources at the cost of indigenous peoples and tribal nations. California's first governor and commander-in-chief, Peter Barnett, declared in his 1851 speech to the California legislature that, quote, a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, end quote. In support, government from the local to federal levels provided financial backing, bounty rewards, and legal immunities to the over 300 local militias that formed across California around the purpose of indigenous elimination, including here in the Bay Area. Following government, military, and vigilante groups conducted indiscriminate massacres throughout California to such degrees that a 1860 report by the California legislature read that, quote, "Within the last 4 months, more Indians have been killed by our people than during the century of Spanish and Mexican domination," end quote. In addition to the state-sponsored genocide, multiple federal and state programs and policies have separated generations of indigenous peoples from their communities, lands, and stewardship practices, including the deceitfully named 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which was a state law that legalized the kidnapping and forced indentured servitude of indigenous children and adults, and continued through the 1900s. Also, federal Indian boarding schools, 12 of which were opened in California, forcibly removed children from their families and used tactics of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse as part of an attempt to assimilate indigenous children into American culture. The last federal Indian boarding school wasn't closed until the year 1969. Other settler colonial policies and programs in California have continued to restrict indigenous land tenure and stewardship practices, and many continue to have lasting impacts. While some indigenous lands in California had already been privatized as part of the Mexican and Spanish land grant systems, upon statehood, U.S. federal laws applied that furthered land privatization and encouraged settlement across the state, including the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Homestead Act of 1862, both of which ignored indigenous land tenure and were provided backing by the U.S. legal system. Land privatization reconceptualized California land as something that could be easily claimed, exchanged, and commodified, even from afar, so as to generate income for the settler government through property taxation and income for individuals through resource extraction. Further, the establishment of public lands has been another vehicle for indigenous land dispossession, including in California. The creation of Yosemite National Park, for example, led to the forced relocation of the Southern Sierra Miwok and other indigenous peoples who had long lived and stewarded within the new park boundaries. This isn't just the case for Yosemite, but applies to local, state, and national public lands throughout California. In your area, in which tribe's territory are the private and public lands you work in or frequent? And what are California Native American tribes' contemporary barriers to access, hunting, gathering, and stewardship there? How's the landscape changed in the last 150 years, given these barriers to indigenous stewardship? Today, California Native American tribes are still in the process of reacquiring lands through land back or negotiating cultural access, co-management, or co-stewardship agreements to be able to access and steward their ancestral homelands, now claimed as private or public. Even more, in 1851 and 1852, the U.S. federal government negotiated 18 treaties with California Native American tribes, which, as shown in the middle map on this slide, would have reserved roughly 7.5 million acres, or 7.5% of California land area for tribes, and would have provided tribes compensation for other lands claimed by the U.S. government. Largely due to opposition from the California legislature, the U.S. Senate rejected these federal treaties in an 1852 secret session and kept them out of the public record for the next 50 years. The unratified federal treaties left most California Native American tribes landless and without compensation, and have had lasting effects. The lack of treaty ratification has limited the ability of many California Native American tribes to obtain federal recognition, such that today California has more tribes that lack federal recognition than any other state. Lack of federal recognition limits tribal access to legal rights, government services, and land-based programs. As a result, California Native American tribes have relatively small land bases compared to other tribes in the Western U.S., as you can see on this third map of California. All to say, when we start talking about environmental management in California, it is important to understand how the land tenure model we're working within has come about, and its explicit roots in indigenous land dispossession and attempted erasure of indigenous stewardship practices. As settler colonialism has imposed changes in who is stewarding land and has land tenure in California, it has also brought changes in how land is being stewarded and managed. Settlers brought new approaches to land management that, instead of understanding humans, plants, animals, and other than human entities as related, rather abstracts nature from complex relationships for the purpose of economic gain or hands-off preservation. I'll talk about generalities of what many call the resource approach to land management and also the conservation and preservation approaches, all of which underlie many of our agency and organizational frameworks, are based on an understanding of humans as separate from nature, and also find their origins in indigenous dispossession and exclusion. In a resource-based approach to the environment, nature is conceptualized as separate, quote-unquote, natural resources that can be controlled, exploited, and commodified. Examples of the resource approach in California include the establishment and perpetuation of extractive and polluting industries like industrial and commercial mining, agriculture, and timber harvesting. When implemented, a resource approach to land management consolidates decision-making power in centralized bureaucracies or landowners, often degrades lands that indigenous peoples rely on for subsistence and cultural purposes, and tends to involve policies and practices that prohibit indigenous access and stewardship of their ancestral homelands. For an example of how the resource approach underlies our contemporary agencies, we can look to the foundations of the U.S. Forest Service. From the late 1800s to the early 1900s, the U.S. Congress designated national forest areas and formed the Forest Service to manage them. The first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, imported a European model of forestry known as quote-unquote scientific forestry, which was developed to maximize timber production by simplifying forest systems and managing for a single planted species. On the left is an undated picture of the model being applied to a historic timber sale area in a California national forest. The scientific forestry model also saw that to maximize forest yields, natural and human disturbances needed to be minimized. And so Pinchot built up systemic fire suppression infrastructure and policies that were promoted through the next century. Among other things, this new era of fire suppression necessarily criminalizes indigenous stewardship, including burning practices. The resource approach is at the foundation of other environmental agencies as well. For example, we can think to government-sponsored agriculture and rangeland programs, which have paid for the draining of wetlands, removal of oak trees, damming of rivers, and introduction of non-native species to maximize agricultural productivity and profits, but have damaged species, watersheds, and landscapes important to indigenous cultures and lifeways. An alternative non-indigenous approach to land management, which many call the conservation or preservation approaches, emerged from Judeo-Christian values and in response to environmental degradation, yet similarly conceptualizes humans as separate from the environment. The preservation and conservation approaches tend to imagine landscapes that have been inhabited and stewarded by indigenous peoples for millennia as uninhabited wilderness, and in many cases continue to prohibit indigenous access to and stewardship of their ancestral lands. For an example of how these approaches have been visualized and promoted, notice this 1859 photograph of Yosemite Falls to the right. Although present nearby, the Southern Sierra Miwok and other indigenous people still living there are not captured in the frame. The conservation and preservation approaches are well incorporated into contemporary policy. For example, the 1964 Wilderness Act set aside national lands to conserve the quote-unquote natural conditions of areas quote-unquote untrammeled by man. Again, notice here how millennia of indigenous stewardship is left out of the frame. In a similar vein, the 1973 Endangered Species Act codified a conservation single species approach to management, failing to account for complex cultural and ecological relationships and the harm of passive management or the exclusion of indigenous practices. As an example of the results of these policies, Indigenous and allied scholars led by Claire Borigter of the U.S. Forest Service write in a 2024 paper, however, 100 years of fire suppression in designated wilderness areas has had long-term negative impacts on fire-adapted and fire-dependent ecosystems, plant and animal species, and human communities. Increasingly, policymakers, scholars, and practitioners are recognizing the importance of restoring Indigenous practices and relationships to their ancestral lands to counter the environmental degradation caused by both extractive resource approaches and hands-off conservation or preservation approaches. So by changing the who and how of California land stewardship, as we have discussed to this point, settler colonialism has negatively impacted cultural, ecological, and social relationships in California. I'll start by speaking to examples of cultural relationships disrupted by settler colonialism. In most cases, the claiming of Indigenous territories for public and private lands has functioned to alienate Indigenous peoples from tending, gathering, and being in relationship with the plants, animals, and other entities needed to sustain their culture and lifeways, or what Karuk Chumash and allied scholars and weavers call in a 2023 paper, a quote, fundamental disruption of the natural and spiritual order, end quote. One example of how a non-Indigenous resource approach to land management has impacted Indigenous cultural relationships is illustrated by the use of pesticides and herbicides by the U.S. Forest Service and Caltrans to manage understory vegetation in Karuk and Yurok territory. Centering resource values, including a single species focus and economic efficiency, the U.S. Forest Service and Caltrans failed to consider that Indigenous peoples still use sprayed areas of the forest for subsistence and cultural purposes. Gathering and processing the sprayed understory species as part of cultural practice, Karuk and Yurok basket weavers in the region have faced increased exposure to toxic chemicals and disproportionate rates of birth defects, miscarriages, and cancer, which scholars link to a continuation of the settler project of Indigenous elimination. In response, the California Indian Basket Weavers Association, or CIBA, has successfully lobbied from the local to national levels for specific pesticide and herbicide bans and reforms. In another example, Indigenous and allied scholars and practitioners write about the impact of settler colonial infrastructure and practices on Indigenous ecologies and sacred places. For example, U.S. Forest Service fire lookout towers have often been placed on ridgelines sacred to the Karuk tribe, and agency suppression activities have co-opted traditional trails used for gathering ceremonial medicinal plants and instructing youth about cultural fire application. Non-Indigenous environmental management practices and policies resulting in increasingly severe wildfires and suppression efforts, coupled with this failure to recognize the cultural importance of specific places, continues to disrupt Indigenous peoples' ability to practice culture, stewardship, and to teach future generations. In addition to cultural disruptions, settler colonialism has disrupted ecological relationships. In ecosystems adapted to or dependent on Indigenous stewardship, exclusion of Indigenous peoples is resulting in significant structural and compositional changes, which increasingly both Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars and practitioners emphasize as a main driver of intensifying environmental issues, like biodiversity loss and the wildfire crisis in California and beyond. In a more specific example, a 2007 paper led by non-Indigenous fire ecologist Scott Stevens at UC Berkeley brings together evidence from fire scars, charcoal deposits, and ethnographic interviews to model the degree to which fire regimes have changed in California under colonial fire suppression programs and policies. The article details how many California ecosystems are adapted to or dependent on fire regimes characterized by frequent low to moderate severity fires that have been lit and influenced by Indigenous peoples for millennia. The author finds that before the year 1800, 4.5 to 12% of California, in other words, at least 4.4 million acres, used to burn annually, and smoke likely filled the skies every summer and fall. However, in the last half of the 1900s, only 5.6% of California burned of what would have historically. Fire suppression policies have led to undesired vegetation responses, including decreased species diversity and increased fuel continuity. And as we have seen vividly in the past decade, the reason for this webinar series is we've been seeing uncharacteristically large, severe, and increasingly frequent wildfires. For many Indigenous peoples, culture is intertwined with the landscape, so disturbances to ecological processes have also been harmful to social and cultural practices. In addition, legacies and structures of settler colonialism have caused political and economic differences between California and Native American tribes and non-Indigenous environmental institutions that have resulted in power imbalances, which are often barriers to coexistence and to Indigenous-led and collaborative stewardship. Power imbalances include that California and Native American tribes still face high barriers to participation in stewardship, and many public policies and consultation mandates still privilege non-Indigenous agency discretion. Further, settler erasure of Indigenous histories and presence continues in many of the ways we write and speak of land management. For example, in many of our conservation plans, management plans, forest plans, and grazing plans, when we recount management history of land we're working with, we often begin with settler practices that have been carried out for the past 4 to 6 generations, instead of speaking to Indigenous stewardship, which has been practiced for hundreds of generations in California and continues to be practiced today. Further, many environmental organizations and agencies, including resource conservation districts, struggle to recruit and retain staff and leadership from underrepresented groups, including Indigenous peoples, meaning we often don't have everyone at the table. Thus, settler colonialism and its impacts, why I'm talking about it today, is because it provides us justification for why we need to be talking about solution-based collaboration with California Native American tribes. I will now transition to talking about Indigenous-led and collaborative stewardship and futures in California, something that gives me great hope. I'll start by highlighting examples going on today and then summarize emerging guidance for how non-Indigenous peoples can constructively show up to these collaborations in ways that share power, land, and resources. Here I'll show pictures of Indigenous mentors and colleagues I work and study alongside, illustrating some of their current Indigenous-led and collaborative stewardship efforts, moving us from an adversarial model of working together to a collaborative one. This picture to the top left includes Alexi Sigona, a colleague who recently graduated from the program I am in and is now a postdoctoral researcher at UC Berkeley. Alexi is a member of the Amamutsin tribal band and is shown here with the Amamutsin Native Stewardship Corps in 2023. In 2012, the Amamutsin tribal band formed a tribal land trust and have developed partnerships, including with Año Nuevo State Park, Pinnacles National Park, Pie Ranch, and the Trust for Public Land to protect, access, and steward their ancestral homelands. The picture here to the top right shows my faculty advisor and mentor, Dr. Peter Nelson, a Coast Miwok person and citizen of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. Dr. Nelson is pictured here in 2023, lighting a prescribed fire at Tole Lake Regional Park, a sacred site to his tribe. This day marked the return of Indigenous lit fire to the site, perhaps for the first time in over 150 years. Alongside CAL FIRE, this burn was conducted as part of a formal co-management agreement made in 2022 between Sonoma County Regional Parks and the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. This photo to the bottom left is of a cultural burn workshop hosted by Ron Good, tribal chairman of the North Fork Mono outside of Mariposa, California. Each year, Chairman Good hosts hundreds of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples from tribes, federal and state agencies, and universities to learn about and implement cultural burns that are inclusive of ceremony, relationship building, and specific cultural goals. Chairman Good also works throughout the state on education and advocacy to promote cultural fire in California and beyond. And lastly, to the bottom right is a photo of Ryan and Ron Reed of the Karuk, Yurok, and Hoopa tribes dip net fishing for Chinook salmon on the Klamath River in 2020. Ryan was a student in the same lab as me and graduated last year. I know he spoke recently with Contra Costa Resource Conservation District about his leadership as a director of the Fire Generation Collaborative, promoting this generation of bringing cultural fire to the state. Ryan's father, Ron Reed, also pictured here, has played an instrumental role in successfully advocating for the removal of the Klamath dams, restoring salmon habitat, and many other culturally important relationships. Ron Reed has also been key in co-founding the Karuk UC Berkeley Collaborative, bringing together tribal staff and citizens with UC Berkeley and cooperative extension researchers to work on securing tribal food and environmental sovereignty. I bring these up because these and so many other ongoing efforts by Indigenous and allied peoples show that despite settler colonial attempts to erase, assimilate, or replace Indigenous peoples and cultures, California Native American tribes have and are strategically and creatively maintaining their residency, autonomy, and connections to ancestral lands and stewardship practices, and they bring immense expertise and knowledge to collaborative work. These collaborations still face barriers, and successful ones show that it often takes many, including willing non-Indigenous landowners, staff, and leadership within our environmental institutions, to support Indigenous peoples' reconnection to and stewardship of their homelands. For this reason, I'll end by offering a summary of guidance from Indigenous and allied scholars and practitioners about how non-Indigenous peoples and institutions can constructively and respectfully show up to their invited roles in collaboration. First, it's important to note that decolonization is a return of Indigenous lands and resources. It's not a metaphor for education or societal improvement. Decolonization includes divestment from colonial power and a recentering of Indigenous philosophies and relationships in ways that avoid colonial tendencies of simplification and racist stereotyping. Second, it is important to recognize and address power imbalances in our environmental agencies and organizations. Non-Indigenous, Eurocentric approaches, frameworks, and worldviews for environmental management tend to dominate in institutions and decision-making today, usually winning out in cases of disagreement with Indigenous partners. Work to remove barriers to power in decision-making processes for California Native American tribes. Third, keep learning about the historical context in which you work. It is important to recognize past injustices that may impact relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in your specific area. Specifically, many non-Indigenous environmental institutions, including resource conservation districts, have played a role in displacing Indigenous peoples from land, attempting to erase or appropriate Indigenous knowledges, and/or suppressing Indigenous practices. Collaborative work between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous institutions may reactivate historical trauma for Indigenous peoples, requiring sensitivity, work on healing and repair, and recognition that these collaborative relationships are often quite different from those with non-Indigenous partners. Fourth, in collaborative work, it is important to be conscious of worldview differences between parties. A good start is to develop an understanding of and respect for Indigenous knowledges and expertise specific to the California Native American tribes you work with. To allow this to happen, cultivate respectful relationships and opportunities for continual cross-cultural education. Also, as non-Indigenous partners, it is important we self-reflect on our own perspectives, institutional cultures, and worldviews. As many resource conservation district projects and other environmental institutions tend to stay grounded in non-Indigenous worldviews. How can our projects respect, find common ground, or even privilege the approaches and worldviews of Indigenous partners, even if our understandings, priorities, and conclusions differ? Fifth, it is important to expand the concept of environmental management and ecological restoration to include social and cultural elements. Indigenous and allied scholars and practitioners describe how Indigenous involvement changes projects, mainly that cultural dimensions and other ways of being and knowing become important. For example, for many California Native American tribes, intergenerational involvement is a priority. Also, project goals, approaches, and measures of success may be different between non-Indigenous and Indigenous partners. For example, Plains Miwok scholar and practitioner Don Hankins describes assessing the health of a landscape by, quote, the diversity and abundance to support material cultural production, including baskets, regalia, and ceremonial objects of Indigenous California, end quote. 6, it is important to implement good consultation practices with California Native American tribal governments and designated community representatives, often meaning that legal mandates need to be supplemented with strong internal policies and adequate staff training. The California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and other environmental laws mandating tribal consultation have known loopholes and barriers to tribal involvement, including non-Indigenous agency discretion, weak enforcement, privileging of Western expertise, knowledge gaps due to sensitive information, and low capacity at both agencies and tribes. Staff of non-Indigenous environmental institutions should become aware of legal consultation and other obligations they have to California Native American tribes so that the burden of education is lessened on tribal partners. Further, it is important to follow proper legal and cultural protocols to respect tribal sovereignty, self-determination, and retained and reserved rights, such as consulting with designated tribal representatives early and often. Meaningful consultation emerges from, quote, the authority and capacity of tribal nations to approve and shape a project, end quote. Superficial and appropriative relationships may threaten tribal sovereignty, community well-being, and the land central to culture and subsistence practices. 7th, recognize that non-Indigenous people likely will not be privy to all knowledge and information held by California Native American tribes, including those and that information related to Indigenous stewardship. Though this does not mean that tribal knowledge and expertise is not there. Often tribal nations and entities need to protect sensitive information and places for reasons including cultural, spiritual, and religious protocols, and also due to well-documented histories of theft of cultural resources, misrepresentation, and knowledge appropriation. 8th and last in this non-exhaustive list, respect tribal sovereignty and data sovereignty by making sure to avoid the appropriation of Indigenous knowledges and stewardship practices. Some refer to the current moment of increased interest in Indigenous knowledges and collaboration as a potential knowledge, quote-unquote, rush. A rush of this kind could be an intensifying of the settler colonial project's aim to erase and replace Indigenous peoples. Instead, respect Indigenous data sovereignty and intellectual property by developing meaningful relationships and supporting tribal nations to retain control of how Indigenous knowledges are collected, represented, and mobilized. And with that, I'd like to end by thanking the many people who got me to this presentation: my family, my friends, my lab mates, Marin RCD and Point Blue colleagues and supervisors, my faculty advisors at UC Berkeley, and also my tribal mentors. I also want to thank you all for listening. Please feel free to follow up with me at the email shown here, mkatuna@berkeley.edu, and we'll spend the rest of the hour in a Q&A moderated by Zoe. If you need a prompt, I'd love to hear, how do you see your role as part of collaborations with California Native American tribes? Also, what are barriers to tribal land access and stewardship that you've identified in your specific work, institution, or places you frequent? Or simply, what are you taking away from this presentation related to your work and relationships? Thanks.
Cool. Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, conversations about settler colonialism and its legacies are very important, especially in this line of work, not only to reshape how we think about fire and the environment generally, but also to guide how we go about managing our land. And it's really awesome to me that there's so many people in here who are wanting to learn more about these systems and how we can work to change them. So just wanted to echo Michelle and say thank you for everyone being here and for Michelle for speaking. Cool. So yeah, maybe I'll give a couple minutes for folks to type some questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. And kind of while we're letting folks do that. I was wondering, Michelle, if you wanted to maybe talk briefly about your PhD program and what you're studying during your PhD, and if there's ways that you either currently or hope to work against settler colonialism.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I'm 3 years into a PhD program and I'm exploring potentially looking at different ways that different tribal nations, recognized and unrecognized, are making agreements to access private lands because I see that as kind of a gap in a lot of understanding of kind of drawing out the models different people are using different legal frameworks or informal agreements. And I'm really interested in how that's working for all parties. So, why are landowners interested in working with tribes? What do tribes need, and are they getting what they need from informal and very formalized relationships? Because there's a lot of different um, legal mechanisms and relationship-based mechanisms that uh, people are using these days. But things are changing really fast all the time. So I'm interested in this point in time and what are people visioning for the future.
Awesome, cool. Thank you for explaining that. Um, cool. So now we also have some like wow, a bunch of questions coming in. Um, So one person is asking, what role do you see academia playing as it relates to conservation and settler colonialism, and understanding how universities perpetuate colonialism?
Oh, that's a really good question, especially sitting in a land grant university that directly benefited off of the theft of indigenous land in getting this institution started. There's a lot to dig into about how universities as institutions perpetuate settler colonialism, especially the large collections of ancestors that UC Berkeley holds and haven't given back to different tribes. So there's a lot of issues there. I think um, I see the role of academia. Before I came back to school, I thought that not that many people were studying this, but I came to find like decades and decades of academics have been theorizing about settler colonialism and also about indigenous futures. And we have a lot of really rad people writing right now about um, how indigenous peoples can be reconnected to land, need to be, why, the reasoning, and how we're working out these collaborations. So I think personally, I see the role of academia being to like hold the conversation and um, maybe hold the conversation outside of some of our institutions where we're caught up in the day-to-day work of land management. And I hope that through some of the thinking going on in academia can start to inform our agencies in different ways forward.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. Cool. And then somebody else is asking, other than fire, what are some of the key indigenous land management practices that have been lost or underused?
Ooh, um, that's so specific to place and nation and family and individual. It's so varied throughout the state. If you think about like how diverse the California landscape is, um, California cultural diversity and language diversity is also huge. So instead of going through a list of like practices, I think that that's really like an invitation to go be in relationship with the indigenous peoples in your area. And I would caution us from saying that practices have been lost because it perpetuates this myth that we've tried to have with settler colonialism that was used to say like we erased everything, and that's just not true. A lot of these practices are still in communities, still held by people, and it doesn't, just because we non-indigenous people don't know about them, it doesn't mean they aren't there and being practiced and being transferred to the next generation.
Thanks. Okay. And are there any agencies or institutions that you know of currently that are doing a decent job at decolonizing their organizations and or engaging with land back that you know of?
Oh, a fellow PhD student in our department, Michaeli Steen, maybe we could send out her contact info later. She's like documenting land back going on right now as it's going on. She works in geospatial analysis and representation, and there's so many examples of land back happening. I know in the North Bay, the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria just had a part of their territory returned to them. I know the city of Oakland gave some land back to Ohlone peoples. I think examples are popping up all the time. I wouldn't say there's like a good, bad, like someone's doing it well, this other agency not at all, because that changes. And I think I've seen the power of the people within institutions to change what the institution is doing. And that gives me a lot of hope. And so I don't think any institution is inherently good or bad. But when we bring different values to institutions than maybe what they were founded on, we can begin to imagine different ways forward and different ways forward of collaboration. But it's also important to note there's Indigenous peoples within academia, of course, and within like the Forest Service. Someone's work I read a lot is Frank Lake, and he's from the Klamath tribes, but he's an Indigenous person, and he's working in fire. He's a fire ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service. He's also a prolific writer. So he's bringing a critical lens to the institution while also working in the institution.
Cool. And another question is, what are some of your personal goals moving forward, and how can other professionals increase collaboration and support for tribes?
Ooh. Personally, I hope we can be having more of these conversations and doing the work of self-reflecting on settler colonialism, on non-Indigenous land stewardship. Because for me, that healing needs to happen on the non-Indigenous end to recognize and do our own education about how do we get to this place? Why don't we have Indigenous peoples on our boards, on our staff? Why are our laws set up so that agencies can move forward with environmental projects without seeking input? And to me, this big absence points to needing to have this conversation. And even personally, like I went through the California public school system, and it wasn't until coming back to college for graduate school that I started learning about almost everything in this presentation. And it kind of started before graduate school. I was standing as a substitute teacher in a third grade class, doing a Petaluma History Day, and I didn't even know the name of the living Indigenous people of the Coast Miwok of that place, and saw myself passing on this story without the full information. And that got me thinking, okay, like what am I doing working in land if not knowing whose land this is and who's been stewarding it for thousands of years. And the kind of the more I learn about it, the kind of the bigger the view becomes that we've really just been taught a tiny sliver of the truth, and it's actually been intentional that we've been leaving out discussion about Indigenous stewardship because it's been in this way to try to take over. And so I forget what the initial question was, but I find it really important to start recognizing that and having this conversation among our staffs about this so we can imagine a different way forward. And as far as recommendations for how non-Indigenous people can show up, here's like the beginning, these 8, is the start of it. But I think it really starts by relationships and being in relationships with the specific people whose land you're working with, and seeing what do they need right now? What are their contemporary barriers? In your institution, do you have power to start to shift things? And go from there. And I think that's what we're working on some in Marin County, but it's a slow process because there's a lot of reasons why tribes have low capacity right now, or are still in the process of nation building. And so, yeah, it's a slow relationship building process, I think.
I also wanted to note, sorry, that we are at 5 p.m. right now. So, if you need to log off, thank you so much for being here. But I think, Michelle, if you still have time, we can
Yeah,
maybe stay on for like 10 to 15 more minutes if folks still want to engage with the Q&A. Okay.
thanks, Zoe.
So the next question is how do you connect academia with the implementation that RCDs do? And I feel like we can also maybe expand this to other agencies too. Just kind of, yeah, where is that connection between academia and implementation?
Oh, interesting. And implementation being like how our projects roll out. I think there's so many ways one could talk about this question, but I see the role of academia is inquiring and collectively inquiring with a larger body of work behind us, and hopefully being part of this like written conversation in the present and into the future. And some things that personally are at the forefront of my mind is like, how are we setting our goals and objectives of projects? For example, we work on a lot of riparian restoration projects, and we say like, okay, we're planting these plants, or we're implementing these practices to try to reduce sediment in water, and we're going to measure it in this way to try to increase species diversity. We're going to measure it in this way, but recognizing that this way of quantifying and kind of aiming our projects is just one way of seeing it. And part of my, like, I think in the implementation realm, and maybe also matching it in the research realm, is looking at different ways of monitoring and conceptualizing projects that we're implementing. Because a lot of money is like, okay, did you meet the grant goals? Did you meet your stated management objectives? But recognizing that those could be really different objectives. We could be, instead of, broad species diversity, we can be like, well, was basketry material produced out of this project? Were multiple generations involved? What's like the longer term health beyond our 3 to 5 year grant timeline? Because we're talking about sites that generations will be coming back to and tending. So that's just one take on how the way we conceptualize projects and revisit projects, maybe shifting lenses can change how we're doing that.
I really like that answer. Thank you. Um, cool. And okay, what are some ways that non-Indigenous people not part of a government entity or conservation organization might develop a meaningful relationship with California Indigenous people and organizations?
Hmm. Yeah, outside of agency work. I guess personally, being in the East Bay, I'm like, there's a lot of activity going on of either different Indigenous-led land trusts or organizations like the Sogorea Land Trust or Amamutsun Tribal Band, their land trusts, who have volunteer work days, for example, or make specific calls out to the broader community. So there are ways to get involved in hands-on ways often, but I think it's getting plugged into your local place and who's active there, and what are the tribes asking for in different ways. Learning more. There's some really great exhibits coming up at the Oakland Museum of California on native burning, and the DeYoung Museum just opened a Indigenous California exhibit. I think is going to be permanent. There's also, I hear about people thinking about leaving their land to their tribe in their area in like legacy estate planning. I think it's maybe like anything, like getting tapped into exact where you are and who's active in organizing, and then what are they asking for might be a good place to start.
Cool. And then we do have a comment that I guess I will read out. So this person says, not a question, but I want to comment on Michelle's prompt. I work for a habitat restoration contractor. My manager and many of my colleagues are from a generation where the goal of ecological restoration is the Eurocentric scientific perspective of restoring to pre-colonial California. But just for the sake of the environment, for example, specific plants and animal species or habitats without regard for the human relationships that shaped pre-colonial California. I'm finding it difficult to change my colleagues' perspectives, but I am hopeful about the next generation of restoration practitioners. And thank you for contributing to the ongoing conversation with your presentation and research.
Oh, thanks for that comment. And there's a lot, like we can follow up after, but it's funny along this path of reading these things to bring together for this presentation and other things I'm studying. Um, there's a lot of like commonly asked questions that I'm like, there's full books written on that. Like people were like, wait, did the genocide happen? And I'm like, this book came out in 2016 that like documented it, like photos, census records, like not that that's necessarily what we want to focus on at all, but I guess all to say there's a lot of resources out there, even short articles or short articles about how to do consultation well that um, maybe we can send out the slides, but in my bibliography at the end, I brought a lot together, but I'd also be happy if anyone wants to email like kind of a specific conversation you're in. I'm like, there might be someone who's thought deeply about this and written it up in a short, coherent way.
Yeah, actually, that would be really awesome. I know we are going to share the recording, but it would be cool to share the slides, if not the
Yeah,
whole thing, maybe just the resources page too, your
yeah,
bibliography.
definitely.
Um, Cool. Um, all right, so I think we have a few more minutes. So, what kind of materials might folks engage with to increase awareness and education? Oh, this is kind of similar to, I think, what you were just talking about. Um, and I think this person also asks, additionally, what are ways that people might engage with tribes if they don't work in land stewardship? Which we did answer, so that's great.
And I might do a plug also for the First Nations Development Institute. They have an ongoing series right now on tribal co-stewardship. It's free and open to the public. And they're an Indigenous-led organization working throughout the nation. But they're having some pretty rad conversations about uh, legal barriers for tribes, about successful forest stewardship, tribally led. So their webinar series is a place I've been learning a lot from. They've been having great stuff.
Cool. Yeah, that's, I think, one of the cool things that was born with Zoom is like having access to a bunch of webinars has been really lovely. Um, all right. Maybe, okay, seems like we have, yeah, one more question left. So is there an online resource that you know of that compiles all of the Indigenous-led organizations, land trusts, etc., that are active in California? Because this person would like to know who's active in the area and was wondering if there's a more centralized way to find them than just through Google.
Oh, um, not that I know of. If anyone does, please pop it in the chat. The Native American Heritage Commission holds the lists of everyone that should be consulted with as part of projects. So if you don't know, like even whose land you're on, that's an important place to start, especially if you're working in land management. Um, Also, native land, is it .ca.gov? Nativeland.ca is where like I pulled the first map from that shows all of California and tribal territories. And on that, on native lands, you can type in your address and find whose territory you're in. And then they also have links to those tribes' websites, which is often a place to start.
Cool. All right. If you have any like closing remarks, that would be great because I think we might be nearing our closeout.
That's all for me, but again, you can follow up with me, Katuna at berkeley.edu. And I thank you all for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle, for your time and for your presentation again. And thank you to the audience members for tuning in and supporting the series. So our next webinar will be Wednesday, October 29th, so next week at 4 p.m. And we'll be joined by Mark Tuckman of Tuckman Geospatial to hear about landscape and wildfire data in the county. All right, thank you so much. See you next time.
Thanks so much, Zoe.